Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. It's been a month since the U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods took effect after the two countries enacted tit-for-tat tariffs. The trade dispute has entered a new phase. Many fear the repercussions of the trade war will not be limited to China and the United States. Before our discussion, let's see how the situation has developed and evolved since July the 6th.
The U.S. began to impose an additional 25% tariff on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods at midnight on July 6. Having vowed not to fire the first shot, China immediately responded, levying countermeasure tariffs at the same level on selected U.S. goods. The U.S. raised tensions higher on July 10th. It said it would slap a 10% tariff on an extra $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. China soon responded, saying it would take necessary countermeasures.
The new U.S. tariffs are typical trade bullying, and China will fight back to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. This is a fight between unilateralism and multilateralism, a fight between protectionism and free trade, a fight between power and rules.
The U.S. began a two-day public hearing on July 24th to finalize a list of Chinese products worth $16 billion that would be subject to a 25% additional tariff. Only 6 out of 82 industry representatives who testified during the hearing agreed with the newly proposed tariffs. In hundreds of comments sent by business associations to the government, more than 90% voiced opposition. However, the U.S. continued to intensify its moves. It announced on August 1st that it would increase the proposed additional duty on $200 billion of Chinese goods from 10 to 25%. In response, China on August 3rd announced a plan to impose additional tariffs on U.S. goods worth $60 billion. That plan covers more than 5,000 U.S. products, with levies ranging from 5 to 25%. China says its new countermeasures are rational and restrained.
More discussion on China-U.S. trade war. With us here in our Beijing studio, Zhang Jianping from the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, Ministry of Commerce. In Washington, D.C., Jeffrey Scott, who is a senior fellow from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. In San Francisco, also U.S., Huang Zhengyu, chairman of U Capital and former White House fellow during the Obama years. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. Have we already decided who is the winner and who is the loser in this U.S.-China trade war? Let's go to Mr. Scott.
Well, there never is a winner in a trade war. When you impose duties on your trade, you hurt your consumers as well as your exporters, as well as your opponents. So it's a lose-lose, and the sooner we stop shooting at each other and sitting down at the table to talk, the better both countries will be.
Are we still shooting at each other, Mr. Huang? How long has that battle continued?
Well, I think we all understand that this trade dispute between China is not simply a trade dispute. It involves discussions around market access for China, intellectual property protection, U.S. restrictions on investments and technology, and geopolitical maneuvering in Asia Pacific. So I think this is a larger issue, and that will not be resolved simply by discussions over trade.
So trade will be the victim, Mr. Zhang?
Yes, I think that some of companies both in China and in the United States and those consumers will suffer from trade war. For example, actually for soybean farmers in the United States, even if Trump administration promised to provide subsidies for those farmers, but it's reported that
right.
For per acre soybean, actually due to the price declining rapidly in short term and the loss about $100, but the subsidy can cover $14.
Right.
So for those farmers, they said that we prefer to have a normal market instead of a subsidy.
Right. Gentlemen, as we speak, there are very mixed messages coming from different sides. Some suggesting, well, maybe already behind the scene negotiation could have some hope. Others say there's absolutely nothing like a negotiation or even consensus for negotiation behind the scenes. The question really is, how long will trade suffer as a victim? Well, as you said, Mr. Huang, the actual decision here between China and the United States is much more than just trade.
Oh, is this a question for
Yes.
me? So I think, again, the consensus around a strategic engagement between U.S. and China, I think that consensus has been on hold. And yet, we don't know what that frame will be now. Would it be direct competition under Trump and further on after Trump? Would it be potentially disengagement, or would it be a return to the norm? And it's hard to imagine a return to the norm as we used to have it. So what is the new norm? And I think that will take time to work out itself. So again, I think this is way beyond the trade imbalance. And also I feel like the conversations have been quite skewed in a way. Because if we look at just trade itself, yes, it is correct that the U.S. and China has a trade imbalance. It's $500 billion versus $130 billion. However, this is not factoring that in 2016, U.S. companies make about $500 billion selling to Chinese consumers in China, whereas Chinese companies make about $25 billion based in the U.S. selling to U.S. consumers. So the larger numbers actually even out between the two sides. And I think it's those two larger numbers that are really the discussion here.
Mr. Scott, having said that, though, what about the current situation? If you look at some of the latest reactions coming from some other countries, not just from China, but also others, on the trade friction with the United States, there are some numbers that we really need to bear in mind. Take a look.
Russia on Sunday started imposing additional import tariffs of 25% to 40% for a range of U.S. goods, like construction equipment, oil and gas, metal processing machinery, as well as fiber optics. The EU is prepared to retaliate if the U.S. proceeds with tariffs on auto imports from Europe. The European Commission is drawing up a list of $20 billion worth of U.S. goods to hit with duties. The Indian government announced new tariffs will take effect in September: almonds, walnuts, and apples.
Well, the list goes on. There are also Canada, Mexico, and some of the other countries. Obviously, Mr. Scott, it's not just a trade war against China, even though China probably has been hit the hardest among all, but yet it seems to be an approach the Trump administration used against many of its major trading partners. The question is, will the U.S. as a result suffer because the others pretty much have become the opponent made by the United States?
Well, you're actually mixing apples and oranges.
Okay.
The dispute with China is about indigenous innovation policies. That trade war has begun, and for the most part, it is not covered by WTO rules. The other actions are about steel and aluminum. That action is much more limited and has resulted in some responses from other trading partners affected by the U.S. protection. And the final big issue is on autos, where the United States is conducting an investigation where no decision has been taken. So I think it's important to clarify that we're really focusing on the implications for U.S.-China relations and the fact that unless we find a way to resolve the short-term political problems we're not going to be able to negotiate a longer-term solution, and the amount of trade covered by penalty tariffs could expand dramatically in the next 2 months before the U.S. midterm elections.
Mr. Zhang, though, earlier on our screen we have shown photos of Chinese and U.S. ambassadors to the WTO. Their latest rounds of debate certainly have won a lot of attention in the international media headlines. Having said that, though, the U.S. tried to limit what it is having with China, the trade war, to what they call the rules from the United States. But China believes this is pretty much the issues that touch on very basic principle of the World Trade Organization. Mr. Zhang.
My sense is that given that WTO provided rules and regulations for international trade and international order today in the world, that would be very valuable for all of those members in WTO, including China and the U.S. So given that U.S. have some of different opinions on WTO, but I'm afraid that those arguing or disputing should be provided on platform of WTO instead of tariff measures. On the other hand, I think that the tariff policy tools from the United States actually not only have negative impact on Chinese side, but also other WTO members, just before we mentioned. So in this regard, I hope that U.S. side should be a responsible WTO member, and also we should appreciate WTO value. So in the near future, also we need to reform and improve the role of WTO.
The question is, Mr. Scott, whether the discussion will further be done in the WTO, or there will be further firing of each other on a bilateral basis, which is likely to have an impact on future trade negotiations, how they will be done. So what we are talking about is just limited to China and the United States, but rather what is going on right now between these two countries, its larger impact on the international trade system and also on the other trading partners, how they are going to deal with one another in the future. Mr. Scott, your comment here.
Well, I think you've put the question very well, and I think Dr. Zhang answered it very well before me. We have a short-term political problem with the U.S. actions that is inhibiting movement towards the negotiating table in Geneva to try to find a multilateral solution. Now, unfortunately, the WTO has not been very productive in producing new rules and dealing with these types of problems in its 20-year history. And so we have a bit of mistrust here in Washington about the efficacy of finding a solution, and indeed the United States and China will have to take the lead in working together if there is going to be any type of progress done in Geneva. It's hard to do that when you're fighting with each other, and so we have to get a ceasefire first on our current trade spat to be able to deal with the long-term problems.
Right. Before we go, I do want to have very short comments from both of you, 30 seconds if you can. Mr. Huang and Mr. Zhang, about China's reform agenda. What is likely to happen? Both China and the United States, its own structural reforms of its own economy amid this trade war or after this trade war. Mr. Huang, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, honestly, it's very opportune that this trade dispute is just between U.S. and China and not a united front led by the U.S. against China. And so I think China has the ability to continue not only to assume the mantle of multilateralism and free trade, but also to live up to some of those high expectations. And I think some of the concerns that the U.S. has advocated is probably privately shared by other countries. But I think if China actually delivers on some of the promises of continued reform and opening up, it will actually address many of those concerns and further really strengthen this multinational, multilateral agreement and approach.
I see. Mr. Zhang from Beijing, once again, structural reforms in China and the United States, both of them, not just one economy, but are you seeing signs? Mr. Zhang.
I think that economic restructuring will take a long time. You cannot solve problems, in short term because structure relying on, long-term, formulation process. Also, I like to say China as the biggest developing economies. Now we are accelerating new round of reform and opening up, especially free trade zones will be duplicated in more provinces. Also, China will aiming for, a free trade agreement network to cover, more and more countries. And then, China's trade and investment liberalization and facilitation also will be better.
Okay, Zhang Jianping, Jeffrey Scott, Huang Zhengyu, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you. Well, that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.